ASP.NET Core allows you to set up a configuration file that can be read in your application. By default, the AppSettings.json file is read from the application and you can use the settings within it. In this video, we're going to show you some of the different ways where you can actually read this file. In addition, we'll show you how to validate a particular configuration, how to set up database connection strings, and how to add app settings into a console application. Now, for more ASP.NET Core coding tutorials, visit roundthecode.com, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/roundthecode, and follow us on Twitter. It's @roundthecode. Join the Round the Code Discord server. Ask your ASP.NET Core question and get our community to help solve your issue. Go to roundthecode.com/discord. So to demonstrate how to read a configuration file into an ASP.NET Core application, we're going to go ahead and create a new ASP.NET Core MVC application. So I've got Visual Studio open in front of me, so let's go ahead and create a new project. So we're going to select ASP.NET Core Web Application. We're going to stick it inside a roundthecode.appsettings, and we're going to call it roundthecode.appsettings.web. Go ahead and create that. We need to select ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller, and that's creating our application for us. Okay, so our application is set up, so we're just going to go ahead and test it. First of all, we're going to point it to localhost :5000. So in order to do that, we need to right click on the application, on the project, and click on properties. Okay, so that's loaded up for us. So let's go down to debug, and in launch, we're going to scroll down to project. We're going to untick the launch browser. And the app URL, we're going to point it to localhost :5000. And we'll go ahead and save that. Let's now run our application and make sure that it's working. Okay, so our application is running. Let's just check that it's going to work in a browser. So we've got localhost :5000 here. And as you can see, our test application is working. That's ready for us now to actually read the actual settings from the configuration file. So now we're going to go about setting up custom configuration. So now that we've got the ASP.NET Core MVC application, we're going to have a look at the app settings. So this now uses a JSON file. If you're familiar with ASP.NET applications, you'll remember you have a .config file, which is an XML file. And the nice thing about JSON is that you don't have these really long tags and you don't have schemas either. So it's a lot more lightweight and compact. Now what we're going to do in here is we're going to create our own custom configuration. We're going to call it round the code sync. And inside that we're going to create a couple of different properties. So we're going to create a title property. We're going to put the label as our sync tool. We're going to create an interval and we're going to set that to 30 minutes. That's going to be a time span. Lastly, we're going to set a concurrence threads property and we're going to put a value of 10 in there. So there's 3 different ways that I'm going to show you how to read the actual app settings file into our application. Now the first way is just to actually bring in the configuration and read it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new controller. We're going to call it App Settings Controller. So that's set up for us. What we're going to do now is we're going to bring in the iConfiguration instance. So we'll bring it in through dependency injection. So first of all, we're going to declare it inside the controller. Now we're going to set up the constructor. and we're going to pass the configuration which we've got from dependency injection, like so. So first things first, we're going to read directly from this configuration instance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new action. I'm going to call it first way. And up here, we're going to set a root of first way. We're also going to set a root in the controller, and we're going to point that to app settings. So quite simply, what we do is we're going to return the content type. And this is one way where we can actually read the configuration, a setting from the configuration. So we've got our configuration instance. We can call getSection around the code sync. So that's this section here. From there, we can call the getChildren method. Then we can call the first or default method. We use the config. So we can find the first config that has a key of title. So in this instance here, it would be this one here. And all we need to do after that is to pass the value in. And we just need to pass back a MIME type of text plain. That's one way of doing it, but it's quite long-winded. Another way you can do it, which is a lot simpler, is if we go onto a new line, we can just quite simply call _configuration.getValue. We know it's a type of string. We pass that in. And then we can pass in round the code sync with a colon and title. So what we're going to do now is we're going to run the application and just make sure that the values are shown. The values should be our sync tool, so we should have two instances of that. So as you can see there, we've got our two instances there. Now that's all very good as well, but what if we want to sort of validate the configuration, or what if we want to bind it into a strongly typed class? Well, we're going to go ahead and do that now, and there's two ways we can go about doing this. So what we need to do first is we need to create a class which represents the round the code sync in our app settings. We're going to create a new folder. Inside here, we're going to create a new interface. We're going to call it round the code sync. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to copy what's in the app settings file. So we're going to have a title, an interval, and the concurrent threads. And we're also going to set the types for each property. So for the title, we're going to set it as a string. We're going to use a time span for the interval. And finally, for the concurrent threads, we're going to use an integer. Now we're going to go ahead and actually create the class for this round the code sync. We create a new item, select class, and call it round the code sync. I'm going to go ahead and copy these properties into there, and we just need to make all of them public. Okay, so the first way of demonstrating this is we're going to use the options pattern. So we have to go into our startup class, and inside that we call our services instance, and we can call add options, and we need to pass in the type, which is round the code sync. We also need to bring in the reference for that. From there, then we can bind it to our app settings. So we do that through configuration.getSection round the code sync. So that's all our settings set up, our configuration set up. We now need to output that actual instance of the class into our controller. So what we can do is we can bring the options pattern into our app settings controller through dependency injection. Now in order to do that, once again we'll create an instance for the controller. So we'll pass in the options interface. And within that we need to specify a generic type, which we're going to call round the code sync. So the class that we just set up with our configurations in it. And we're going to call that _round the code sync options. Now we're going to bring this into our constructor. And we're going to declare it with the same value we're passing in through dependency injection into our instance in the controller. Now that we've done that, we're going to create a new route. I'm going to call it second way, and a new action. And once again, we're going to demonstrate how to actually output the value of title from the round the code sync. But this time, we're going to do it through the options pattern rather than using the configuration instance. So quite simply with that, we return the content again. And all we need to do here is we need to call our instance of _round the code sync options. Use the .value. And then we can just either pass in the title, the interval, or the concurrent threads. We're going to select title. So let's go ahead and run that and see if it's actually going to work for us. So as you can see on the screen, that's now working for us. Now there is another way I'm going to show you on how to actually read that file. So if we make a stop to that, so we don't need to include it in the options pattern. We can actually read the round the code sync interface directly. Now if we go back into our startup, the way that we can do this is we can add a singleton. And within that singleton we pass in what will be an instance of round the code sync, which will represent the round the code sync class. So with a singleton you can use a delegate, and that's what we're going to do here. We have to pass in an instance here of service provider, which is service provider type. And in here we can return the configuration. So we get the configuration from here. Get section. As you can see, it's similar to what's going on here. And the only difference is we need to call the get method. And this will now bind it into our round the code sync type, like so. And what we need to do just before we run this is we need to make sure that the round the code sync has an interface of round the code sync. Otherwise it's not going to work. As you can see, we haven't got any errors now, so we can go back into our controller. And once again, what we're going to do with this is we're going to create a new action. We're going to call it third way. But before we do that, we need to pass in our instance of round the code sync. So remember, we've already set this up now as a singleton, so we should be able to pass it in as a parameter into the constructor. Okay, then it should just be a simple case, passing in our _round the code sync and passing in the title. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we pass that in as public. And that will fix our error for us. So let's go ahead now and run our application. As you can see, we're also able to output the settings directly through the actual instance of the configuration. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is validating configuration. Now what we can do is, because we've created a strongly typed class for our settings, we can go ahead and use data annotations. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. So for the title, we actually want to declare that we require to have a value for it. And with the concurrent thread, we want it between a particular range of 5 to 15. So anything outside below 5 or higher than 15 will throw an error for us. Now we're going to go into our app settings file here, and we're going to change some of these settings. So we're going to get rid of our title, and we're going to change the concurrent threads. Now this on its own will not actually validate it. We need to make a change in our startup. So we're going to try it for the second way, so using the options pattern. And quite simply with this, we can just call validate data annotations. So we're going to go run our application now and see if it actually causes an error or not. So as you can see on the screen here, we've got our errors here. So we've got data validation failed for members, title with the error, the title field is required, and the same for concurrent threads. The field concurrent threads must be between 5 and 15. Let's go ahead and put that back to how it was, and let's rerun it again and see if it actually runs for us. You can see no issues this time. It's managed to run for us. Now with our other way, so directly bringing in the iRun the code sync interface, we need to make some changes in the startup as well. So first of all, we're going to remove the validate data annotations so it doesn't conflict. So that's from our options pattern. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go to our singleton. I'm going to take this away and we're going to store this into a variable of config. Next, we need to know it needs to validate against the data annotations, and in order to do that you can use the validator class. So we need to bring in the reference for that, and then we can call the try validate object. We pass in our instance of the config. We need to create a new validation context instance. Once again, we bring in our instance of the config, and this is just what this does is it lists all the errors. We're not going to be outputting this at all, so we're just going to create a new list instance in here, but not set it to a particular variable. So a new list of validation result, and this validate all properties. If this is set to false, then it will only validate attributes that are required. We need to set this to true. Fix the error there. Now, if valid is set to false, what we can do now is we can set up our own exception. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So if it's not valid, we throw a new exception. Oops, if I can spell properly. Not all the settings are valid. Assuming everything's fine, we just return our instance of config. Now, once again, we're going to demonstrate that. So we're going to remove the title and we're going to set the concurrent threads to 18. Run our application and see what happens. So we called the URL there and we've got our error. We've got our exception here. So you can see here it says not all the settings are valid. Let's go ahead and put the app settings back to how it was. Run the application again. I'm going to refresh this. And as you can see, our configuration is now working for us. So the next thing I want to do is to create a separate configuration file. Now this is handy if you have a large application with lots of settings. You can separate it out into individual files. So in order to do this, what we do is we create a new file. So add new item. And what we want to do is we want to create a new JSON file. We're going to call it round the code sync. We take that out. What we're going to do is if we go into our app settings, we're going to take this out of AppSettings.json and we're going to put it in here. We also need to make sure, this normally does it automatically, but we still need to make sure that we set the build action to content and the copy to output directory as copy if newer. If this is set to do not copy, it's not going to copy the file when we actually build the application. So it won't be able to read the application and it will almost certainly either not read the file or it will throw an error. But that's all good. Now to set this up, we need to go back into our startup class. No, we don't. We need to go into our program class. That's what we need to do. Now in here, we can call a method, which is called configure app configuration. What we need to do now is we need to specify this extra file into our instance of host. So in here, we can pass in two parameters, hosting context and config. And quite simply, our instance of config, so this is a instance of iConfiguration builder. In here, there's an add JSON file method. So we're going to specify our round the code sync.json. Going to make it optional, it's not mandatory, and reload on change. We're going to set that to true as well. Right, with that going, let's run it in our application. Let's run our application and see if it loads up in our browser. Okay, so our application is running now, so let's load it up. You can see it's working with our second way. Let's try it with the third way. So directly through the round the code sync instance. And as you can see, that is working for us in a separate file. So now I'm going to show you how to import connection strings configuration. Now in front of me, I've created this round the code sync database. Go into dbo.sync. In here, it's just got an ID and a name of round the code sync. We're now going to use that and we're going to import it into our application. So what we need to do first is we need to declare the connection string. So in order to do that, we use the connection strings key and then we're going to give it a name of syncdb, and this is where we place our connection string. So the server is localhost, the database is round the code sync. I'm going to use a trusted connection, multiple active set result sets. I'll set that to true. I'll bring this over a bit for you so you can see. And then integrated security, we're going to set to true. So that's now set up for us. What we need to do now is we need to install a NuGet package. Go into Tools, NuGet Package Manager. Run the install package command, and we need to bring down system.data.sql client. Now that that's done, we're going to go into our app settings controller and we're going to create a new action. And make it asynchronous and bring back a task of action result, and we're going to call it database. I'm going to set up a root for it as well, and we're going to call that database well. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable of name. I'm going to make it empty at first. I'm going to set up a new connection string. Create a new instance of SQL connection. So inside the SQL connection, one of the parameters is the connection string, which we've just set. So in order to get that, we use our underscore configuration instance, which is up here. And quite simply, we call the get connection string method, and we're going to specify syncdb. Now this syncdb, if we go back into our app settings, that is our connection string here. So it's just representing what's in our app settings. Now we need to open our connection. And we're going to run a SQL command. So to do that, I'm going to create a new instance of SQL command. And we're going to run select star from dbo.sync. We go back into our database. That's this table here, where ID equals 1. And we need to pass in our connection. Over a bit for you. Now we're going to create a new data reader so we can actually read the value. I call execute reader async. And we'll call await reader.read async, so it's now reading the values from our actual command. We can set the name from our reader, and obviously name is the column name for it, and we just need to declare it as a string. And finally, what we need to do is just return that name part of the content type. So we're going to pass in the mine type of text plain. Okay, let's give that a run and see if we're getting that value back in our browser. So as you can see, it's returning our value from our database. So we've got round the code sync there. And as you can see, it's the same value in our database. Now the next thing I want to do is to show you how to use app settings in a console application. And once again, we've got Visual Studio open in front of us, and we need to go ahead and create a new project. So for this one, we're going to select console app.NET Core. Now we're going to make sure it's in round the code app settings, and we're going to call it round the code.appsettings.console app. That's now going ahead and creating our application for us. Okay, so that's set up for us. We just need to make sure that we've set it to .NET 5. So that's loading up for us. So yeah, it's on .NET Core 3.1. Let's just change that to .NET 5. Okay, so we're now going to go ahead and create our app settings file. So we'll select JavaScript JSON configuration file. We're going to call it app settings. Now, one thing to bear in mind when you do this with a console application, the build action and the copy to output directory are none and do not copy. We want to set the build action to content and the copy to output directory to copy if newer. That will now make sure that our app settings is copied over when the console application is built and when it's running. Now we're going to set up our app settings file. Once again, we're going to bring in round the code sync. And we're going to pass in the title again, our sync tool, the interval, and the concurrent threads. Now, in order to make this work in the console application, we need to bring in some NuGet packages. So there's a number of these we need to install. So the first one is Microsoft extensions.configuration. We also need to bring in Microsoft.extensions.configuration.json, and we also need to bring in binder as well. So bring that down there. We also need to bring in Microsoft.extensions.options. And finally, we need to bring in the Newton.soft.json package. Okay, that's all done for us. Let's now go ahead and create our config files again. So this is copying what we did with our ASP.NET Core MVC application. So we're going to create a new instance again. Go up here, call it interface even. I run the code sync. Make sure it's public this time. And we're going to pass in the title, the interval as a time span, and finally the concurrent threads. Now we're going to create our class. Call it round the code sync. And pass those properties in. And make sure they're all public. Now that we've got that all set up, we go into our console application here. What we need to do is we need to create a new instance of our config. So we call a new instance of the configuration builder. If you're doing this in ASP.NET Core, we already have an instance of configuration builder. But with a console application, or if you're using testing or anything like that, you'll need to create a new instance of it. Go ahead and do that. We add our JSON file, which we've called AppSettings.json. If you wanted that to be a different file name, you can do. And just call build. Now from there, we've got our instance of config. So what we can do is we can set up round the code sync. So once again, we call our config get section. This is very similar to how we did it with our ASP.NET Core application. Get section, and then we call the get method, and we pass in round the code sync. So that will bind our round the code sync settings into our round the code sync class. Now, like with an ASP.NET Core application, we can use our validator class to make sure that we can validate it against particular data annotations like requiring the title or having the concurrent threads in a particular range. So once again, we call our validator class. We need to bring in the reference for that. Try validate object, round the code sync, a new validation context, passing in round the code sync again. Give that overview. And then pass in a new instance of validation result as a list. And set validate all properties to true, like so. And if it can't validate it, we're going to just throw an exception. Unable to find all settings. Now that that's done, we're just going to output to the console each of the settings. So we're going to call round the code.sync.title. Do the same for interval. And do the same for concurrent threads. And do a read key here. Now run the application and make sure that it's working. Oh, we've got an error there. Where's the error? Yes, we need to bring in the reference for list. Run that again. So you can see there it's outputting our settings. What we need to do now is stop that. We need to make sure that our validation's working. So we'll get rid of the title and we'll set the concurrent threads to 18. Let's run our console application again. And you can see that's running because we didn't actually add our data annotation. So let's go ahead and do that. Set the title to required. And set the concurrent threads to a range of 5 and 15. Let's run that again and see if we're going to get an error or not. As you can see there, it's throwing our exception. So the validator is working in our console application. So that's how you get going with ASP.NET Core's configuration. It's good that you're able to bind the settings into a strongly typed class and be able to validate them. In addition, it's also good that we're able to separate each group of settings into separate files and into separate classes. This makes it ideal whether you're writing a small application or a large application. Now, thanks very much for watching and hit a like on the video.